George Bush Sr. was President of the United States from the year of 1989 until 1993. His road to presidency, however, included many successes as well as failures. He was born on June 12th of 1924 in Milton, Massachusetts. Despite Bush being born into an inherently wealthy family, his parents raised him to be modest and greatly encouraged their child to give back to society through public services. Growing up, his wealth accounted for more opportunities that he was given, such as attending the boarding school of Phillips Academy, Andover. During his time at the school, Bush became senior class president and captain of the baseball and soccer teams, which demonstrates his early leadership qualities. When he reached the age of 18 in 1942, he enlisted himself into the Navy and ended up serving during World War II, where he eventually became the youngest pilot in the Navy. Overall, his time in the military had awarded him the Distinguished Flying Cross for heroism under fire. In 1945, Bush enrolled into Yale University after being discharged from the Navy. At Yale, he completed an accelerated program for an undergraduate in economics so that he was able to graduate in 1948, also being part of the Skull and Bones Secret Society. George Bush's father was a Republican senator for Connecticut from 1952 to 1963, giving him a family connection towards the start of his political career. After being president of a subsidiary in 1954, he later became a Republican Party chairman for Harris County in Texas. He spent a lot of his time in this position making political connections as well as strengthening his conservative image. Bush was in a seat for the House of Representatives for Houston's 7th District in 1966 and was elected again in 1968. Although Bush had lost in running for Senate in Texas twice, his second time being in 1970, President Richard Nixon assigned Bush to be chairman of the Republican National Committee in December of 1970. Furthermore, George Bush was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, in 1975. During this time, the CIA was emerging from a controversial period in its history and needed a strong, effective leader to improve morale and reform the agency. By most accounts, Bush was a popular director and able administrator, states an article written by Stephen Knott. Lastly, leading up to his presidency, he served as vice president under Ronald Reagan. During his inaugural address, Bush advocated for volunteerism of the people and unity throughout the United States, promising to aid the homeless and less fortunate through 1,000 points of light of all the community organizations that are spread like stars throughout the nation doing good. During Bush's time as president, the federal budget was at $2.8 trillion in 1989, which heated the president's ability to enact any major domestic programs simply because there were no revenues for them, as well as a political climate which would not allow for new domestic programs to be enacted. As for the president, he planned on using his limited agenda, foregoing his plans with domestic policies. These policies were surrounding volunteerism and both education and anti-drug reforms. Although Bush had pledged not to increase taxes, he was not able to do so in order to solve the deficit problem of the budget crisis. This awareness was brought to the press in June of 1990, and many people were unhappy with President Bush. Later, Bush and Congress had reached an agreement on the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1990 after a short government shutdown when he had vetoed a previous budget proposal. This act raised taxes while reducing government expenditures in order to relieve some of the deficit. While Bush was president, the savings and loans industry was collapsing. To curb this, Bush cost taxpayers over $100 billion in an effort to bail out the dwindling industry. Also, the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA, was passed on July 26 of 1990 and forbade discrimination based on disability in employment, public accommodations, and transportation. This bill increased available transportation as well as available business places or public venues for the disabled. This act was supported by Bush as he agreed that disabled people would be able to become more independent with their own jobs and would not have to rely on welfare rolls from the government. Furthermore, after the Exxon Valdez oil tanker ran aground in March of 1989, the public became aware of necessary environmental protection because of the 10 million gallons of oil spilled during this disaster. This aided Bush in passing the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 on November 15th of that year. as well as appointing William Riley, an environmentalist, to lead the Environmental Protection Agency. Bills including curbing of urban smog, acid rain, and eliminating industrial toxic chemical emissions were included within the Clean Air Act amendments.
The Bush presidency is viewed as a success in terms of foreign affairs. President H.W. Bush spoke of the importance of unity in the executive and legislative branches. It was important to him that the U.S. presented a united front to the rest of the world. He assembled a team of advisors, including Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Colin Powell. These advisors helped Bush approach foreign affairs with his characteristic conservatism and pragmatism. The president did not rush into new actions or policies and utilized personal diplomacy as his strength. Bush's foreign policy ideals were put to the test when former CIA informant Manuel Noriega nullified the results of Panama's presidential election. Noriega's puppet candidate lost the election of May of 1989, but was still instated as president, violating the laws of democracy. Noriega became vastly connected in the drug-dealing network as well as a suppressive dictator. Bush started working on removing him from power, but did not support an internal coup that seemed unreliable. When the coup failed, many blamed the United States for not getting involved. In December of 1989, the Bush administration was notified that Noriega's military had killed a U.S. serviceman. This was the justification that Bush needed to send in military force to remove him from power. On December 20th, the United States military sent 10,000 forces to join those already in Panama. This was called Operation Just Cause. In January, Noriega surrendered to U.S. forces and was later convicted of drug charges. This operation was the largest military troop deployment since the Vietnam War and is generally considered a success. This also improved Bush's reputation, establishing him as a powerful and decisive leader. This was shown through polls that revealed a large number of citizens in Panama supported U.S. intervention in their government. However, the U.S. actions violated international law and were denounced by the Organization of American States and the United Nations. President H.W. Bush is also credited with improving U.S.-Soviet relations. In his inaugural address in 1989, Bush said that a new breeze is blowing, and great nations of the world are moving towards democracy through the door to freedom. When the Berlin Wall was torn down, Bush did not gloat in the Soviets' faces, only saying a simple, "I'm very pleased." His response angered some, arguing that Reagan could have celebrated the historic achievement with a speech. In December of the first year of his presidency, Bush discussed armed relations with the last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. In June of the following year, there was a summit in Washington, D.C., where the two world leaders signed an arms reduction agreement. Both countries promised to decrease their nuclear arsenals. In July of 1991, Bush visited Moscow and signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. The efforts of Bush and Gorbachev improved relations greatly between the two nations, especially during the Cold War. Critics say that Bush was too closely aligned with Gorbachev and too willing to give in to his demands. To support their argument, they say that Bush should have met with Boris Yeltsin, president of Russia, who was more willing to proceed at a quicker pace and transition away from communism. President H.W. Bush is internationally known for dealing and leading the United States through the Syrian conflict. On August 2, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. The president of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, wanted Kuwait's land, wealth, and most importantly, oil. Fearful of Iraq controlling Kuwait's oil, President Bush, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and Gorbachev assembled against Iraq. Surrounding Arab countries also joined the fight. The operation was called Operation Desert Shield and had 4 principles: immediate and complete withdrawal of Iraq from Kuwait, restoration of the legitimate Kuwaiti government, stability and security of the Middle East, and protection of Americans abroad. The United States and United Nations formally condemned the invasion of Kuwait and demanded that Iraq withdraw through Resolution 660. The United States also froze Kuwaiti and Iraqi assets, and the UN imposed economic sanctions on Iraq. Bush used his personal contacts to telephone world leaders and build the coalition to force out Iraq, proving he was an influential leader around the globe. President Bush described Hussein as the embodiment of evil and highlighted human rights violations to create a pathos appeal among U.S. citizens. However, President Bush did not want to go to war and tried to meet with Hussein to solve the conflict. Hussein refuted all his efforts. On June 12, Congress voted to authorize the use of military force against Iraq, and Operation Desert Storm began. Hussein's forces were hit with massive airstrikes, and a ground war started on February 27th, but the war lasted only 2 months. When Hussein retreated out of Kuwait, the Bush administration was recognized as completing the largest military action since Vietnam. This was very important because it restored U.S. morale and support of the military. Critics argue that the victory was shallow because Hussein remained in power, but to refute this claim, others say that removing Hussein would have created instability throughout the Middle East. The Bush administration completed their initial goal of removing Iraqi forces from Kuwait. The legacy of H.W. Bush's presidency is best known through his hope for a new world order. This was a period of cooperation achieved by breaking down Cold War alliances. In an address to the nation about the start of the Persian Gulf War, Bush said, "We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and our future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the rule of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we will have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders." Those in opposition of Bush's administration say that the goals were not stated clearly. They say that it was too difficult to justify U.S. involvement in certain situations without a clear national interest. On the flip side of this, it is argued that the U.S. has a responsibility to take on a bigger role as a world leader and defend against human rights abuses and defend democratic nations. To support this, the United States gained new legitimacy with the Middle East after the Persian Gulf War. Bush's legacy can be clearly seen through the period of worldwide cooperation that followed his presidency.